One of the most famous Egyptian tomb curses was never actually written in stone. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the sleep of the pharaoh. Newspapers swore that warning stood above the doorway of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Later writers carved it into legend. But when you go back to Carter's photographs and the epigraphic record, that sentence simply isn't there. The inscription was a fabrication. The curse, however, was not, because within months of the tomb's opening in 1922, a wealthy English earl was dead of a sudden infection. The lights reportedly failed across Cairo at the moment of his passing, and a list of mysterious deaths began to grow in the world's newspapers. Tonight we open File 19-07, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. What, if anything, was really waiting behind those sealed doors in the Valley of the Kings? A boy king, a staircase, and a headline. November 1922. The Valley of the Kings was already crowded with royal burials when Howard Carter's workmen uncovered the top step of a cut stone staircase beneath discarded huts. Over the following weeks, the team cleared a descending stairway to a sealed doorway stamped with the necropolis, seal, and Tutankhamun's cartouche. On the 26th of November, Carter peered through a small breach in another plastered doorway and saw wonderful things: golden shrines, beds, chariots, and deeper inside the nested coffins of an almost untouched royal burial more than 3,000 years old. The discovery was already a media event. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron, had sold exclusive rights to the Times of London. Other newspapers, shut out from the tomb itself, went hunting for their own angles. They found it on the 5th of April, 1923, when Carnarvon died in Cairo from pneumonia and sepsis following an infected mosquito bite. Within days, reports linked his death to an inscription that no Egyptologist could ever quite locate. One popular version read, "They that shall break the seal of this tomb shall meet death by a disease which no doctor can diagnose." The wording echoed real ancient curses. The context did not. To understand what was really going on, we have to step back from Tutankhamun and ask a broader question. What did the ancient Egyptians actually write on their tombs? And when did the idea of a mummy's curse really begin? The curses the Egyptians did write. Curses on tomb walls did exist, but they were rarer and more practical than horror films suggest. In the Old Kingdom mastaba of Kantaka Ikeki at Saqqara, a carved facade warns, "As for all men who shall enter this, my tomb, I shall seize his neck like a bird. I shall cast the fear of myself into him." Another inscription from a different tomb threatens severe divine reproach for anyone who pries out a stone. Beware of forcefully removing this stone from its place. Great lords of the West will reproach him very, very, very much. These are not booby traps. They're legal and religious notices in stone, a supernatural no trespassing sign. As modern Egyptologists point out, such warnings were psychological deterrents aimed at tomb robbers, not mystical landmines designed to wipe out future archaeologists. After the Old Kingdom, explicit curses become less common, though some later tombs still invoke the wrath of gods like Thoth or Sekhmet against violators. The consistent theme is protection of the burial, restoration of offerings, and punishment in the next world more than theatrical deaths in this one. So ancient Egyptians did believe their tombs were sacrosanct. The house of eternity was not to be disturbed. But the idea of a vengeful mummy stalking the living is conspicuously absent from their own texts. That idea would come from somewhere else. A Victorian ghost grows legs. Long before Carter found his staircase, Western readers were already primed to fear mummy curses. In 1869, Louisa May Alcott, better known for Little Women, published a short story called Lost in a Pyramid, or The Mummy's Curse, in which a plundered mummy exacts supernatural revenge. Late 19th century fiction repeatedly returned to the same motif. Disturb an Egyptian tomb, suffer mysterious consequences. The trope hardened in popular imagination thanks to stories like the so-called unlucky mummy, a coffin lid in the British Museum blamed, entirely without evidence, for assorted accidents, illnesses, and shipwrecks in the decades before 1922. By the time Carnarvon died, newspapers didn't need an actual hieroglyphic warning. They had an entire pre-existing script. So when a cobra killed Carter's canary in its cage, an incident breasted, and others recorded, local rumor immediately treated it as the king's Uraeus, the royal serpent, striking back. And when Carnarvon's infection turned fatal, headline writers reached for phrases like mummy's curse and pharaoh's vengeance that would have been perfectly at home in a penny dreadful. The legend latched itself to the tomb of a little-known boy king, and it has refused to let go. The death list. What then of the deaths themselves? Carnarvon's case is clear. Medical reports describe erysipelas at the site of a mosquito bite, progressing to septicemia and double pneumonia. In an era before antibiotics, this was tragic, but not mysterious. Others are regularly added to the supposed role of victims. Arthur Mace, a Metropolitan Museum archaeologist, died in 1928 of complications from pleurisy and pneumonia after years of poor health. Radiologist Archibald Douglas Reed died in 1924 following an operation. Several journalists and visitors succumbed to infections or chronic conditions in the decade after the opening. Tabloids turned each obituary into another tally mark for the curse, often ignoring how many others on the exposed list were still very much alive. Howard Carter himself lived until 1939, nearly 17 years after first entering the tomb, dying in London of Hodgkin's disease at the age of 64. Lady Evelyn Herbert, who accompanied her father and Carter on that first clandestine visit, lived until 1980. If there was a supernatural assassin at work, it was taking its time. The curse story thrives on selective memory. Early deaths made front pages. Long lives slipped quietly into the back columns. But statistics, unlike headlines, do not have much patience for drama when the numbers do not obey. In 2002, epidemiologist Mark Nelson decided to treat the curse like any other alleged health hazard, as a question of survival curves. He reconstructed a cohort of 44 Westerners Carter listed as being in Egypt during the early years of the tomb's opening, then split them into those who had been exposed to the tomb-sealed areas and those who had not. The result was quietly devastating for the legend. Those who entered the tomb or burial chambers had a mean age at death of 70. Those who were exposed averaged 75. The difference was statistically insignificant. They also lived, on average, roughly 20 years after their supposed exposure, entirely normal for their social class and era. Line those lifespans up like columns of hieroglyphs, and the grand pattern of doom collapses into what it probably always was, the ordinary mortality of early 20th century professionals with a few sad outliers. Nelson's conclusion was blunt. There was no evidence to support the existence of a mummy's curse, yet the myth kept walking. Dust, fungi, and stranger ideas. If statistics do not support a supernatural curse, could there still be natural dangers hiding in tombs? Egyptian and European doctors have long noted that ancient tombs can contain high levels of dust, mold, and fungal spores. Aspergillus species in particular have been suggested as contributors to respiratory infections in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces. Some modern commentators have speculated that such organisms may have worsened Carnarvon's already vulnerable health, turning a mosquito bite and shaving cut into a lethal septic infection. These hypotheses are plausible, but not proven. They shift the curse from gods to microbes, from spectral revenge to occupational hazard. A more radical proposal emerged in 2024 when Ross Fellows argued in the Journal of Scientific Exploration that unusually high rates of hematopoietic cancers among Egyptologists could hint at low-level radiation exposure in some tombs, possibly from ancient use of uranium-rich materials. He notes that certain ancient texts speak of a house of millions of years, whose violators will meet death by a disease which no doctor can diagnose, language later echoed in popular accounts of curses. This is at best an intriguing speculation. Limestone tombs generally show low background radiation. Claims of anomalous levels are contested and difficult to verify. For now, the idea remains on the fringe of Egyptological science. What is clear is that tombs are not sterile environments. Whether through fungal spores, fine dust, or simply the strain of hard labor in desert conditions, early 20th century excavations carried real physical risks. You didn't need a curse to die in the Valley of the Kings. You just needed bad luck, limited medicine, and a long voyage far from home, where the curse really lives. So what do we do with all this? On one side, the record shows authentic Egyptian tomb curses exist, but they are rare, formulaic, and focused on protecting the dead and preserving offerings. The phrase allegedly inscribed on Tutankhamun's doorway was a journalistic invention. The death toll around the tomb is indistinguishable, statistically, from what we would expect without any curse at all. On the other side, we have a legend that refuses to die, reinforced every time a documentary needs a hook or a headline needs a shiver. One interpretation is straightforward. The curse of the mummy's tomb is a mirror we hold up to ourselves. Victorian fiction, colonial anxieties, and early 20th century media competition converged on Tutankhamun at the precise moment when archaeology was becoming spectacle. The curse gave Western audiences a way to dramatize their own unease about prying open the graves of another civilization, to turn moral discomfort into supernatural melodrama. Think of it like a projected image on a tomb wall. The story we shine onto the stone says more about the projector, about us, than about what's carved there. There is a second, more grounded reading. Even stripped of magic, tombs carry risks. Dust, pathogens, structural collapses, and long expeditions in harsh climates can and do kill. Modern studies of fungi and other contaminants in sealed spaces underline that ancient sites can harbor invisible hazards. From this angle, the curse becomes a kind of crude epidemiology, a way for people with limited medical understanding to link a cluster of misfortunes to a common cause. When cause is invisible, story fills the gap. Both interpretations face limits. The psychological reading doesn't explain why the curse myth attaches so powerfully to Egypt in particular, when grave robbing and tomb excavation have occurred across cultures. The hazard reading struggles against the hard edge of the statistics around Tutankhamun's tomb. If microbes or radiation are at work, their effect on overall survival appears surprisingly modest. And hovering in the background are the real Egyptian texts, calmly promising judgment, fear, and divine reproach to anyone who violates the house of eternity. Those warnings weren't written for us, but we read them anyway. Two readings of a curse. We're left with two very different curses. In the first, the only power in the mummy's tomb is coincidence amplified by credulity, a few ill-timed deaths, a handful of fungi, and a century of eager storytellers. The real danger lies not in the stone chambers beneath the desert, but in our willingness to trade evidence for a good shiver. In the second, there is a kind of curse, not supernatural, but ethical. Every time we slice open a burial, put a human body in a glass case, or turn a sacred space into a backdrop for tourism, we inherit the weight of that act. The Egyptians carved their warnings for tomb robbers. We turned those warnings into set dressing, then wondered why the story still haunts us. The physical curse may be fiction. The cultural one isn't so easy to dismiss. Somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, a narrow doorway still descends into the rock, past painted walls and golden shrines, toward a young king who never asked to be famous. The seal has been broken for more than a century. The arguments about what that means haven't stopped, because every mystery hides a truth.